Okay, so again, thank you all for joining us. This is the first of a 3-week course on inequity in Chicago public schools, which is a good topic for our community, not only because it's raises matters of social justice in our communities, which is something that we as a community are very interested in and want to do better, but because a lot of us have family members who are in the system, being a church that's downtown, we grapple with these issues. So we're grateful that we have this opportunity to explore these issues. We're going to meet the next 2 weeks at 9:30. So for that'll complete the 3 weeks. And I believe if you signed up for this one class, you're then automatically, you have the link and you can use that link for the next 2 weeks, again at 9:30. Don't forget, we also have, through the Adult Education Committee, offers classes on foundations of faith, an hour with the Bible and Fourth Church Clergy, which is Sundays, every Sunday at 12:30. So there's an 11 after this, there's an 11 o'clock service. We have a coffee hour, and then 12:30. You'll see on the website, fourthchurch.org. There's a schedule for discussions about aspects of the Bible. So we hope you can join us for that as well. If you want to learn more about the other course offerings throughout the fall from the Adult Education Committee, you can go to our website, just look under the tab of Education Discipleship and go to the name of our program, which is the Academy for Faith and Life. I also put information in the chat area and a link if you want to take a look at that. Now, the Adult Education Committee does work not just with ourselves, but we reach out to and work with other committees throughout the church that provide substantive focus. And one of those committees is the Action for Equitable Education Committee, which spurred us to offer this 3-part course on inequity in Chicago public schools. And we have on this webinar Janet Volk and Claudia Jackson. They're the co-chairs of the Action for Equitable Education Committee. And if you want to learn more about that, they will put that information in the chat, how to contact them for more information. They are also sponsoring the Action for Equitable Education Committee is sponsoring a forum on Tuesday, October 6th on the Illinois Graduated Tax Amendment, with a special emphasis on the impact on education. That's Tuesday, October 6th, 7 o'clock. And we put information on that in the chat function as well. So again, thank you for joining us. Today's speaker is Derrick Dawson. We're very happy to have Derrick with us today. He is native of Chicago's South Side. And he told me earlier he lives in the South Loop now, and he is co-program coordinator for Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism, which spells out ROAR, Chicago ROAR. And he's an organizer and trainer for Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training. Derrick brings a very strong background in religious affairs. He has served on the Standing Committee of the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago, and he served several terms as co-chair of the Anti-Racism Commission of the Chicago Diocese. Previously, he served in the Navy as a broadcaster and journalist in the Pacific, and he worked for more than 20 years as a corporate trainer for major law firms in Chicago. So like I said earlier, he does want to facilitate discussion. If you're online, if you can put your comments in the chat section, and then I'll call on you that way, or he will. And if you're on the phone, just speak up when you can, and we'll do our best to accommodate you with that. One last thing, I sent out the notice for this class, a series of classes, to several tutoring groups in the Chicago area. And I just hope that at least some of you are on the call today. And if you are a volunteer tutor, whether it's with Fourth Church or otherwise, we just welcome you, especially and your work is very valued in our attempts to bring a little bit of equity to education in Chicago. So before we begin, let us do what we usually do and say a short prayer. So let us pray. Blessed are you, Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, for inspiring us to come together this morning. On this day of rest, may we be restless as we bear witness to our failure to pursue justice and love for your children. On this second day of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, as we hear the siren of the ram's horn, the shofar, may it be the alarm that awakens us from slumber, holds ourselves accountable for the oppression of your children, and opens our minds and hearts to a world where we hear not sirens, but the ring of freedom for all. Amen.
It's just not this guy as much as the.
And now we will turn it over to Derrick Dawson. Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you, Ira. Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be with you this morning. And especially those of you who I know several of you, it's good to see your faces. I want to be fully transparent. As Ira said, I am from Chicago. I'm from the south side of Chicago, and I am a product of the Chicago Public Schools. I went to grade school or grammar school at a school on 91st and University in the Burnside neighborhood. It was called Oliver Perry. And I was at Oliver Perry during the period of white flight in Chicago in the 1960s. In fact, when my brother and I started at kindergarten in the early 1960s or the mid 1960s, we were the first two African-American kids at that school. And by the time I graduated from the 8th grade at that school, there were no white kids left at the school or the neighborhood. That's how quickly that neighborhood changed. I left that school and went to high school at a school that still exists in some form called, in those days it was called Lindblom Technical High School in the West Inglewood neighborhood. And Lindblom was the first selective enrollment high school for Black kids in Chicago. It opened, or Whitney Young opened right about the time I started school there in 1975. Although I have to say, when I was at Lindblom during the 1970s, it wasn't an all Black school. It was about 90% African-American and 10% Chinese because of Chinatown's close proximity to Lindblom. It's also true that during my entire 4 years at Lindblom, I never had one conversation with any of the Chinese kids at the school. In fact, I don't remember anyone African-American having any relationship whatsoever with the Chinese kids. We led completely separate lives. And I left Lindblom with a pretty good education, and I left Chicago in 1980 to go to college at the University of Colorado at Boulder to study architecture. Although my path was a little bit altered, I had my first 2 racial incidents at the University of Colorado at 17 years old. The first was when I handed a professor of English my paper, and when he gave the papers back, he did not give mine to me. And when I asked why, he was very blunt. He said, "I do not believe a Black boy from the south side of Chicago could write a paper of this quality." And what he said was, "If you really wrote this paper, I need you to prove it to me by sitting in front of me in my office and writing another paper on a topic of my choice while I watch." And unfortunately, it began one of the most shameful experiences of my life, even to this day, because it never occurred to me that I had a choice in the matter. And I did exactly that. I sat down in front of him and wrote another paper while he watched me. And I have to say, it was a brilliant paper. And through that experience, I actually changed my major from architecture to English. And I got my first job as an adult in the English department at the University of Colorado, where my responsibilities were to tutor functionally illiterate African-American football and basketball players on the University of Colorado teams. And it was after that experience that I left the University of Colorado and became a broadcaster and journalist for the United States Navy. And I spent about 10 years on ships in the Pacific, the East Pacific and the South Pacific. And one thing I learned then And I still say to this day, if you want a clear understanding of race and racism in the United States, it can be very helpful to leave the United States. I got back to, landed back in California just in time to get arrested for protesting the Rodney King trials. After that, I spent time up and down the West Coast. This is where I began my career in law as a paralegal, and eventually moved back to Chicago, where I transferred my law career here as a training manager and paralegal for major law firms here in the city. And during that time, I started going to an Episcopal church. I'm a cradle Episcopalian. I was baptized at St. Edmund's Episcopal Church in about 1966 on the south side of Chicago. And when I moved back, I decided to go to church again. And I landed at St. Martin's Episcopal Church on the west side in Austin, where I still am a member. And Reverend Juan Reed, who was the priest at the time, became my mentor. And he insisted that anyone who is a member or even attending his church go to a Crossroads 2.5-day analysis training. And I didn't know what that meant, but as a good Episcopalian, I went to the Crossroads training, and it really reframed my entire life up to that point. Because I realized during that training that maybe there is something to this notion of systemic and institutional racism, even though I had no idea what that meant before that point. Coincidentally, I had another incident at my current law firm at the time. Even though I had been at the firm about 7 years at that point, one of the partners in the firm called me the N-word in a voice message that was accidentally left on my cell phone. So based on the training I had gone to, I ended up suing the law firm. I filed an EEOC claim. And I decided that based on the learnings that I got from that Crossroads analysis workshop, that I was not going to leave the firm. If anybody were going to leave the firm, it would be the partner. And I stayed at the firm for another 7 years using the tools that I learned in that workshop and went about the business of transformation. And I'm proud to say that by the time I left the law firm, it had substantially changed from when I started in terms of race and racism. And about that time, I started continuing to volunteer with Crossroads, but eventually I could no longer reconcile having 1 foot in law and 1 foot in social justice. I also became disabled about that time, and I decided to shift my priorities, and I left law and started working full-time with Crossroads, which is a national organization, but my primary responsibility is to co-lead Chicago CROAR here in Chicago. And through that work, I worked with many, many institutions, including Chicago Public Schools, several schools in the city, and at every level of the school. And I want to be very transparent. My specialty is anti-racism and anti-oppression, although I do a lot of work around anti-racism and anti-oppression in the Chicago Public Schools. As we move throughout our time together this morning, I just want to be transparent that I am not a school policy expert. My knowledge is from the perspective of an anti-racism organizer and trainer, but I have gained a little bit of knowledge about how systemic racism works in the Chicago Public Schools. So my hope is to focus mostly on that as a way of helping us frame the series that you all are engaged in over the next 3 weeks. I think would be very helpful. And what I was asked to do is kind of frame the conversation so that you are aware of Chicago Public Schools as a system and individual schools as institutions, so that you can hold that context as you go about the series these next 3 weeks. So that's a little bit about me as a facilitator. I do want to share my screen for a moment so we can talk about the context of what we're hoping to do over this next, over our time together. So what I hope you're seeing on the screen is a list of objectives that we're going to go through, that I'm going to help us walk through. And the first, as I just indicated, is to think a little bit about what do we mean by systemic and institutional racism. It's interesting because during this time of COVID and George Floyd, more than any time in my life, I'm hearing the word systemic and institutional racism from many, many corners of our society. But it's also clear to me that even though we're using those words more and more, it doesn't necessarily mean that we all are on the same page about what those words mean. So I want to take a little bit of time again just to help us think about what the meaning is so that we can all have a shared language and a shared understanding. I want to talk a little bit, and I'm going to show a short video about the history of public schools and what they were meant for, information that all of us may not be familiar with. I'm going to talk about white flight. I just mentioned it a moment ago, but white flight is one of the beginning things we need to understand in terms of how we got where we are today in terms of our public schools and the Chicago public schools in particular. And that's going to lead us to a conversation about the disparities. In the promotion for this series, there was a conversation about the disparities between Whitney M. Young High School and the school, Harlan, I believe it's Harlan High School on the south side of Chicago. So we're going to explore those disparities a little bit more. And then we'll talk about how those disparities lead to something that we call the school to prison pipeline. And hopefully we'll take time out at the end of all of this for a little bit of reflection and some questions and answers that may be generated throughout our conversation. And certainly, if any questions come up or comments or thoughts that you may have in the midst of all of this, as Iris said a moment ago, please let us know, and we're happy to stop at any time and address your questions or concerns to the extent that we can. So if there are no, I'm going to pause for just a moment, Ira, and see if anybody has any questions or thoughts about our objectives this morning.
So far, so good. Well, not so good, but so far, everyone's just listening and waiting to comment until they learn more.
All right, thank you. So let's start with answering the question, what is systemic racism? And in order to talk about this, I want to use a framework that we always use at Crossroads and Chicago CROAR. And this equation is not very complicated on its surface. It's simply that racism equals race prejudice plus the misuse of power by systems and institutions. And we use this framework for three reasons that you see on the left side of the screen. One is because we want to make sure that when we're talking about racism, that we're talking from a perspective that includes an historical analysis. We are where we are in terms of racism in the United States because of a certain history that started, according to some of us, about 500 years ago or more, with the doctrines of discovery coming out of Europe and people like Pope Nicholas V. So we want to make sure that when we talk about racism, it is grounded in history and not ahistorical. We use this framework also because it is rooted in the real lived experiences of people of color. There are so many times when I watch the news or read certain commentary, and it's a bunch of white people discussing whether racism exists or not. It is ridiculous to talk about racism and think about racism in a way that does not include or take into consideration the real lived experiences of people of color. And finally, we have this definition or this framework because we understand that diagnosis determines treatment. If we don't talk in very real terms about what racism means, then we're likely to come up with solutions that have no basis in reality and no possibility of transformation or making change. If you have the wrong diagnosis, for instance, often the diagnosis is that we need more education. Well, we are very clear at this point that education is not the way of getting rid of systemic racism. If you can educate racism away, like sexism and misogyny and other forms of oppression, then we would not have it anymore. So we need a correct diagnosis in order to apply the correct treatment. So this is the basic framework that we're talking about. Now, let me unpack this framework and this equation for just a few minutes. One is the first part of this is about prejudice. Race prejudice and bias are systemically and institutionally constructed, and reinforced. What does that mean? It means that our institutions communicate to us who is good, who is better, who's on the top of the hierarchy, and who is not. We often think it's just something that we're born with, and people will often say, don't we all have prejudice? And don't we all have bias? And I would suggest that that is very true. But here we are talking about race prejudice. And it is also true that all of us have race prejudice, but we have race prejudice because our systems and institutions tell us how to be prejudiced in terms of race. In fact, if you are in the United States, this is part of who we all are. I suggest that you can't even immigrate to the United States. If you try to come to this country based on the 8 or 12-hour flight, you are going to receive messages about who is good, who is bad, what people's roles in the hierarchy are, based on things like who is flying the plane, who is carrying the luggage, who is cleaning the bathrooms at the airport, what images do you see on the television screen as you're flying over the Pacific or the Atlantic to the United States. You are receiving all kinds of messages that are being translated through institutions like the media about where people and individuals and racialized groups lie on the hierarchy. This also means that white people and people of color internalize a bias for whiteness and a bias against people of color. This is important because it means a couple of things. One thing that it means is that all of us, even me, who identifies as an African American, has received messages that as an African American in this racialized society, that I am lower on the hierarchy than white folks are. White folks receive that message and people of color receive that message. We call it internalization. This also means that there is no such thing as reverse racism. Often we hear things about, well, what about Black people who don't like white people? Isn't that reverse racism? And the reason that is not is because another part of this definition has to do with power. And so people of color can indeed be prejudiced against white people or other people of color. The difference, though, is that we as people of color do not have the power and the backing of those systems and institutions to reinforce that. And so one example I often use, you may remember this case a couple of years ago in, I think it was Houston or Dallas. And there was a young African-American man named Botham John who was eating ice cream in his apartment after a long day of work. And a white police officer entered into his apartment by mistake. She had been drinking. She walked into his apartment thinking it was hers and immediately shot Botham John dead. For weeks after that, there were all kinds of questions around, was she a racist? In fact, there were even questions about how he was responsible for his own death. And they talked about his background and how he had had a run-in with the law perhaps when he was 13 years old. I asked the question, if a Black man had accidentally walked into the apartment of a white woman and shot her dead, would we have had questions about why she was responsible and how there were mitigating circumstances? And after all, the Black man was very tired and it was just an accident, an unfortunate accident. You may remember in this case that the brother or sister of Botham John forgave immediately, and the media lifted that up. And somebody even massaged the shoulders of the white woman who had killed them, and we were encouraged to feel badly for her. As people of color, we do not have the backing of institutions to support the racial prejudice. Now, I talk about the misuse of power. The misuse of power here is important in this framework because the misuse of power can be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes I tell a short story of my sister. She went to the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana back in the 80s. And she did not go to a very good high school, and she was struggling. She had to get tutors to get her up to speed academically. And so when she got to the University of Illinois, she decided that she wanted to study finance. And she went to the counseling center, And there was a young white woman who was a student, but also a senior student who was serving as a career counselor. And she looked at my sister and told my sister that she should not study finance, that she should study economics. Because as a young Black woman, finance would be very difficult. And it would be a much easier path for her if she studied economics. Because, and I quote, "you can always get a job with the government." Now, there's no sense that this young white woman woke up that day with the intention of harming young women of color. But she had received the messages that young Black women could not possibly compete, and that she thought she was helping my sister by creating a smooth path for her because of the racial prejudice. The difference, though, is that this young woman had the power of the University of Illinois to back her up. And my sister might have listened to her because of that power. Fortunately, my sister did not listen to her, and she's a doctor in finance today, and she teaches finance at Loyola University. But we talk about the misuse of power because it can be intentional or unintentional. It can be well-meaning, well-intended or ill-intended, and it can be conscious or unconscious. Many of us in the helping professions unconsciously misuse our power by disciplining, for instance, Black boys more harshly because we want to prepare them for the harsh world. We think we're doing the right thing, we think we're helping, but if we're not conscious of how systemic racism plays out, any of us are subject to misusing power. Alice Walker is quoted as saying, "one of the greatest misuses of power is by denying the power that we have." I don't have any power. The power is all, in fact, I remember doing a training for Chicago Public Schools incoming principals. And the conversation went to, well, I'm just a principal or I'm just a teacher. I don't have any power. The teacher said the principal had the power. The principal said, I don't have any power. It's the superintendent that has all of the power. So it's important to understand how this misuse of power works in the context of that framework of what systemic racism is. And so I'm going to stop there for a moment, just to see if, again, if there are any questions about why it's important to understand this framework of the difference between systemic and institutional racism and the kind of racism that we often hear about. Often, the reason that we are focused on the individual and not the system is because focusing on, is this individual a racist, distracts us from looking at the systems. So when a cop murders a Black kid on the street, the first question we ask is, was the cop a racist? So that we can get rid of the, quote, bad apple, as if that means we're getting rid of racism. But if we don't look at the police departments that train the cops, that hire the police officers, the thin blue line that protects the police officers that are, quote, bad apples, then we are distracted by the focus on the individual, and the system and institution goes about its business with impunity. So again, are there any thoughts or questions about this framework of what we mean by systemic and institutional racism? Ira, please let me know when it's okay to move on.
I'm sorry. I just was still on mute. There's a few comments in the chat. I'm not sure if anyone wanted to elaborate on those or not. If you do, just unmute yourselves and we'll figure that out. Or if anyone on the phone would like to say something at this time or ask a question. Okay, I think we can move on.
Great, thank you. So now that we've laid the groundwork for what we mean by systemic racism, I want to jump to the schools. And I came across this video a while back, and I thought it's really instructional about why we have public schools. It feels like it might be an obvious answer, but this very short video helped me understand this as a grounding understanding a lot more. So I'm going to play this video, and it's called A Short History of Public Schools.
The model of going to school to learn is relatively new. Before 1900, Most children learned at home and out in the real world. In 1837, the state of Massachusetts formed the first state board of education with Horace Mann as its secretary. Mann believed that everyone was entitled to the same content in education. Returning from a research trip to Germany in 1848, Mann lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted. He quickly set about establishing a statewide system of common schools, staffed by professionally trained teachers. His ideas quickly gained momentum, and by 1852, Massachusetts passed a compulsory attendance law. Mann also believed that school could become a great equalizer, and values such as obedience to authority, promptness in attendance, and organizing time according to bell ringing would help students prepare for future employment in an industrial age.
And the whole purpose of it is to create a docile factory military workforce. And the whole purpose is to subordinate children and get them in that mindset of being subordinated so they grow up to be subordinated adults.
The poorest class I've had. Prussian schooling had been out to destroy the imagination. In every public library worth its salt in the United States and in every college library, you will find a collection of essays by a Prussian philosopher, Johann Fichte. Fichte said we have to set up a system of universal forced schooling in which we destroy the imagination. Bells, ordered lessons, constant testing, ranking.
The entire system is designed to regiment a large group of people and to get them all to do the exact same thing.
By 1900, 34 states had compulsory schooling laws. Half the nation's children attended one-room schools. And by 1918, every state required students to complete elementary school.
The reality is they want children to take their place in society, be cogs, and keep this system going. So you're going to school to take your place.
Now the trouble's with your attitude. You don't pay enough attention in class. You don't do enough work outside of it.
I find that video so chilling. And so now that we understand the purpose of public schools, and remember the last dates they talked about were the 1920s. Well, white flight in major northern cities in particular happened very shortly after that, particularly after and during World War II. Because what happens in that period is soldiers start coming back from the war, and we've got something called the VA bill. And the VA bill, of course, gives housing vouchers to all service people, but because of things like restrictive covenants and discrimination and redlining, African-American soldiers coming back from the war cannot move to certain neighborhoods and reduce the living in ghettos. In Chicago, this was called the Black Belt. And so as we see, as late as 1940, all but 3 Chicago neighborhoods had white majority populations, except Douglas Grand Boulevard and Washington Park on the south side. This was known as the Black Belt. And it was known as the Black Belt because people who came to Chicago as Black people during the Great Migration were restricted to these areas. White people, of course, could live anywhere. Now, when World War II ended, whites, because they had the money from the GI Bill and the growth of the suburbs, white people began moving to the suburbs, and restrictive covenants that had prohibited Blacks from living in most neighborhoods were struck down by the courts. By 1950, the Black Belt had expanded all over the South Side. And by 1980, which is the year I graduated from high school, it was no longer a Black Belt. The entire South and West Sides were African-American and segregated at that point. And I mentioned during my introduction how my neighborhood was a prime example. On the south side of 91st and Cottage Grove, the entire neighborhood went from all white to all Black within a 10-year period. It was a total ethnic succession. In one generation, a third of the city's community areas went from monolithically white to monolithically Black. Now today, there are only 21 neighborhoods in the city of Chicago that have majority white people, and only 12 have populations of white people that exceed 63%. From 1960 to 1980, Inglewood's white population plummeted from 51,000 people to 818. And I checked that number, it is accurate, according to the Chicago Reporter's history of the Inglewood neighborhood. Think about this last line: not even ethnic cleansing in the Balkans achieved the levels of turnover that white flight in Chicago did. I put that there not only to emphasize those statistics, but also to think about the level of violence and trauma that comes with that kind of shift, because it's not just white people leaving the neighborhood, but it means that there's a disinvestment in that neighborhood, and the Black folks who end up with those homes cannot, because of redlining, even get loans to fix up those homes. And so the neighborhoods deteriorate, the people are isolated, and you can imagine what that happens to the Chicago public schools at the same time. This is a violent 10-year period that leads to the city of Chicago that we have today. Now, this is a quote from Natalie Moore. She is a reporter on WBEZ. You may have heard her voice. She recently wrote a book called The South Side, A Portrait of Chicago and American Segregation. And this is her quote from the book: "I see a lot of middle-class parents, regardless of race, jockeying for slots in the elite public schools. Chicago has created more of them over the years, but the flip side is that neighborhood schools are left behind. I've lived in two Black South Side neighborhoods, Chatham, a middle-class community where she grew up, and Bronzeville, an up-and-coming area. As an adult, in both neighborhoods, middle-class families did not or don't send their children to the public elementary school, and especially not the high schools." I want to be clear, she's talking about middle-class Black people. So not only are the schools in Chicago becoming more and more Black, but the students who are going to those schools have a tendency to be the most marginalized, impoverished Black people, because even middle-class Black people are either moving to suburbs or sending their kids to elite schools. And the city begins and promotes schools like Walter Payton and Whitney Young, because these are elite schools that can have people escape the neighborhood schools that are becoming more and more decrepit. Now, we do want to talk about solutions, and what Natalie Moore says is that, and she's talking about the assumption that because the city is now 90% Black, or at least the Chicago public schools are 90% Black, the notion is often that nothing can be done. But Natalie reminds us here that we can redraw school boundaries. We can create regional magnet schools instead of schools that siphon off the brightest kids, and do something about housing patterns and change those structures. Yes, please.
Yeah, we've got some comments in the chat, kind of stemming from the video and these latest slides. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, let's stop
now, or if people want, care to speak, or or elaborate on their questions or comments. Maybe we can give a 30 seconds or a minute to see if anyone wants to do that.
Absolutely, Ira. Thank you.
And if you can unmute, if you want, otherwise we'll move on. Or maybe the comments just, hello.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, because I think it's a fairly critical point, that part of the problem is the fact that the public schools, we've been brainwashed to believe that their role is to instill strong concepts of equality, and the fact that the U.S. is a classless, quote, society, unlike, say, England or other European countries where there's this strong element of social class consciousness, but that in the US were exempt from all those stereotypes. I mean, this is all obviously untrue, but I believe that that's a concept that at least I could feel was being instilled in me when I was growing up and participating in the public school structure. Thanks.
Absolutely, Mike, I agree. And what you're saying is reinforced all over the country by the fact that public schools are supported by property taxes. So that if you live in a community or can afford to live in a community that has a high tax base, which means home ownership, then you have better schools than public schools. There is no equality possible under a structure like that. Thank you.
Yeah, Annette. We have to unmute Annette.
I wanted to say that there's this concept that if you just understand, things will change. And we've spent a lot of time on so-called understandings, reading the books of history, understanding the history of the Black people, blah, 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 blah. And the fact is, what I would challenge people with is, what are you going to do about it? I mean, understanding, if you had a liberal arts education, you read all the right books, The Fire Next Time, all that kind of stuff. I don't think it's about understanding. I think it's about how do we put the action forward. And I would also say, as long as real estate works the way it does in Chicago, I'm a former Chicago public teacher, you can't effect change because everybody's concentrated in one area. And the only hope for Black people is this lottery system, which we have to admit is kind of archaic, that your child could draw a school that would be much superior to the one in their neighborhood. Okay, yeah. I'm finished.
Thank you, Amanda. Amanda, I hear you. I do want to gently push back a little bit on the understanding part. And here's why. One of the things we talk about at Crossroads as supporting white supremacy is an either-or thinking, that you either study or you do. And I agree with you completely that we have a worship of the written word. And there's a reason that Ta-Nehisi Coates books and Ibram X. Kendi books are all sold out right now, because people turn to reading, and if I read one more book, I'll be anti-racist. I agree with you completely. However, one of the reasons I believe that we have not gotten very far in terms of addressing systemic racism is because one of our values as Americans, particularly white America, is that we need to do something. And we often respond by saying, I'm going to do something on Monday. And because we don't have a deep understanding, the policies that we put in place often cause more harm than good. Because we don't do the right kind of reading. We don't listen to people of color necessarily. We don't actually study how systemic racism has historically played out. And so we often jump to action and then replicate or cause new problems. So I believe that a both and can be helpful. How do you do the kind of study and reading that you need to do to understand, while also not believing that reading one more book is going to cause the kind of change that we need to make?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, I had a question, Derrick. My daughter goes to Whitney Young, and it was interesting seeing the Natalie Moore quote. And I guess my question for you, or just kind of to provide another perspective, is that I think that the creation of the magnet schools and the selective enrollment schools wasn't at the time necessarily seen as a perpetuating inequality and racist and what have you. But I mean, I think the reality was that privileged families were moving out of the city or sending their kids to private schools. And, you know, my understanding, at least, and maybe I'm off base here, is that CPS just tried to keep families in the city and keep kids in the system, and bring kids from different parts of the city together, from families that had a culture of learning and academic excellence. And I guess what I'm wondering is, like, I don't know if the alternative doesn't seem realistic to me, which sounds like we'll just have kids who are excelling academically go to the neighborhood schools. That just doesn't, I mean, it may sound like a nirvana situation, but just practically it just didn't seem to be an option. And I guess I'm struggling with, what is the, practically speaking, what are other models of integrating and so that everyone has greater opportunities. And
Yeah, I hear you, Ira. Sometimes what I say is that we want to pay attention to the difference between intent and impact. I think you may be right as far as the intent of Whitney Young. But here's the problem. If you look at the statistics between Whitney Young and Harlan, Whitney Young has a Black population of 18.5% students. The Chicago public schools are 90% African American. And so what that means is that a very small number of Black folks who make up the majority of schools have access to Whitney Young. So creating one Whitney Young that has room for a few Black kids, while the rest of Chicago public schools, 90% of people go to schools like Harlan, where it's 98% Black, but it has a graduation rate of something like 48%. And out of those few who graduate and go to college, only a few of those make it. So where is the equity in creating special schools in the city where most people don't actually have access? And the lottery system does not work because that siphons the numbers off even more. So statistically, the result is that Chicago can say that we have these high graduation rates if we decrease the population in the schools, create dropouts because of the inequities, and then focus on the Whitney Youngs as if Whitney Young was representative of Chicago public schools. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is that the intents that you name may be correct, but Ira, nobody in Chicago, in terms of the South and West Sides, the 90% of school kids, has access to those 200 seats that may be available at Whitney Young. And so we continue to replicate this system, but as long as we can say that we have a Whitney Young, which is a great school, but no Black people in a city or Latino people have access to it, that becomes a problem that has to be addressed. And then we siphon people off to charter schools. But charter schools, for instance, and this impacts me as a person with a disability, charter schools are often outside of the requirements of educating everyone. So charter schools don't have to take people. Many of the elite Black schools remain elite because if people are performing academically, they kick the kids out of the schools to maintain their numbers. And so you can see this starkly. Whitney Young, far above expectations. Harlem, far below expectations. All of this gets played out in terms of the numbers.
Okay, and we did have a comment that people would like to hear more from you about how to think about the issues and maybe put off solutions till a little bit later. So
sure, well,
that's a good transition to continue.
Yeah, and because of time, let me go here and show some of the possible solutions. Many of these solutions are what some of the school closing fights are about, and the reason that Chicago Teachers Union are pushing for many of these, right? So removing police officers from schools. You've heard about this. In fact, let me go. I want to show this video because it's only a couple of minutes long. But that conversation we were just having, Ira, about the difference between Harlan and Whitney Young creates certain outcomes. And one of them is the school to prison pipeline. So I'm not going to take time to read the slide, but I am just going to show the video. It's only a couple of minutes long. And let's take a look at this before we think about the solutions that have been offered.
The school to prison pipeline is the description of how the school system is set up to push you into the prison system. School's no longer a community. School's no longer a family, a place where we're always welcome.
You walk into school, the first thing you see is a metal detector. The first face that greets you is a school police officer.
All the kids want to do is go to school. They don't want to go to school to be labeled a criminal.
When folks talk about school to prison pipeline, it's real. There's a direct correlation to lack of education, economic opportunity, and also incidences of incarcerations.
We have had kids in the system, hitting somebody with a ruler. We've had kids in the system tussling or fighting in the hallway.
They put me in a cell, took me and handcuffed me to the chair.
I sat in the cell for 11 and a half hours.
I was having an emotional breakdown because I knew in my heart that I didn't really do anything. I just felt like I was being criminalized. These are my kids, and this system has taken them and turned them into something they're not.
I think zero tolerance actually makes schools more dangerous. It creates the illusion of safety, but not the reality.
The concept of zero tolerance makes no sense anywhere for anything.
It's a recipe for disaster for a lot of young folks. We know that it doesn't work. It would be insane to continue this policy.
To feel alienated and to feel watched in your own school is not healthy for that student.
If you disrupt the positive things going on in his or her life, they may never get that back.
This criminalization is not just an inner city problem. It's happening in every school district, suburbs, inner city, all over the place.
What if we stopped and we looked at each one of these students as a human being and said, what can we do to help you become a better student?
I think when we ask the question, what can we do? It's important to first understand and remember that what we're talking about in terms of race and racism and all these things in Chicago public schools, that it is a subset of racial policies and racism in the United States at large. This is not a separate issue, it is part of the issue. And when you hear things like school closings and all of those things, and we think nobody has thought about anything that could be done, the reality is that many people talk about possible solutions, but they often get ignored because of also financial system. That school to prison pipeline, that prison industrial complex, is a huge financial generator that sacrifices kids, because once you go to prison, you can no longer vote, you have a felony record, you are reduced to being a service employee and serving white society in low-paying jobs for the rest of your life. There are intentional reasons often why we incarcerate African-American people to continue to create a class of low-paid workers to feed the system. And you can see on this slide some of the proposals and thoughts about what it means to dismantle this. You heard some of them in the video. And I'm going to start there because I know our time is short, Ira, and I'm sure others have thoughts or comments that they would like to share.
Can everyone see the slide? Maybe Derrick, if you can.
Am I not showing it?
Yeah.
Ira, you're not showing it.
Thank you very much. Let me go back to it.
There we go.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
If anyone has a question, it's going to be hard for me to see you raise your hand. So if you could just even put a chat in to me, or everyone just say, hey, I'd like to say something or whatever, that's fine. Or if you're on the phone, speak up. We're all learning about Zoom. I see on my Zoom group chat that if you click on the 3 dots to the right of where you would type in something, it enables you to save the chat somewhere on your computer. So if you want to get access to the links that have been provided, that appears to be a way to do that.
I also believe, Ira, that if you're the host, the chat will automatically be downloaded or sent to you by Zoom and or saved in your documents someplace.
Okay, we can post that as well. We are, as you know, we're recording this, and I think eventually we'll get that up on the website. So, any questions or comments?
I would like to comment. Donna would like to comment.
Okay. But yeah, unmute yourself, Donna. You're muted again.
What we've looked at is data that is looking at high school.
Yes.
And I would hope we would redirect all this interest, all this activity at the beginning school experience. I'm talking kindergarten, first and second grade. Involving parents, involving a connection between home and school, that school is important. We are working together. Your child is special. Your child can learn. This is where we begin to invest our money, and we help these kids move on, feeling prepared, feeling they can compete. How many homes have books in them? There are book deserts. How many neighborhoods do not have a bookstore? Books are expensive. I would like to see us move in this direction. I'd like to suggest that. Thank you.
Absolutely, Donna. I would agree. And again, I remind us that the reason there are book deserts, the book deserts are also food deserts. And unless and until we address systemic racism broadly beyond schools, it is going to be impossible for change in schools to happen. As long as we have an underclass of people who are so impoverished that they have to work 5 jobs, they're not going to be able to support their own children. And the school system will never be able to be a substitute for a job, or a parent who is engaged, or parents who are sent to prison because of the prison industrial pipeline that we just talked about. The schools will not be able to be transformed unless there's a system-wide transformation and an acknowledgement of the economic pressures that systemic racism are causing.
Claudia, you had something?
Am I unmuted?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I posted a link because this is something that kind of shook me out of my, I got this, I figured out racism, I understand how to I've done all my research, all that. It's from Malcolm Gladwell, and it's called The Re-Education of, it's a teacher's name, Mrs. Buchanan. And it's a reimagination of the whole Brown versus the Board of Education. And basically it makes you rethink what you've always been taught, which is what I believe Derrick has been saying to us. What we think we know is what we've been spoon-fed, not really what has happened. So we as white privileged people that grew up in the system, we only know what we've been taught, and we really have to break down everything in our brains, throw it away and start again and rethink everything we have been taught. Black schools are not bad. Black teachers are not bad. Black communities are not bad. It's not a bad thing to have I don't think, or at least I've read, it's not bad to have a school that's majority Black, as long as you've got high learners as well as the slow learners. You've got good teachers, you've got good resources, you've got good curriculum. It's not about being Black. It's about being oppressed. Derrick, correct me if I'm wrong, but these are some of the things I'm learning.
No.
And taking schools out of the neighborhoods doesn't make any sense. It just allows for worse segregation and worse oppression. And I'm just going to say, the slide you put up that started with Chicago has no imagination, I loved that. Like, I mean, how do we as Chicagoans, especially wealthy white Chicagoans, push this whole, how do we have imagination? How do we reimagine? Because the system is just broken and fixing it is stupid. We need to throw it away, start all over, and teach all of us how to think differently. And
Claudia,
to be a part of that, I don't know how to do it.
Claudia, you are so right. It would help if we could start by being vulnerable enough to admit that we have substantially and unconsciously bought into the message that Black people are inferior.
Right.
So that when we see these things happen, it doesn't strike us as if it would if this were happening to our white children. And unless we acknowledge that systemic racism has embedded those messages of inferiority in us, we will always operate as if we know what's best, because we are taught in this country that Black lives don't matter. That's also what the Black Lives Matter movement is about. Because for everyone who says all lives matter, they are not looking at the Chicago public schools and the realities of the things we've been talking about. But we can't even admit that. Even though we acknowledge slavery, we are ahistorical and can't acknowledge the impact that it has on our systems like Chicago public schools. So we think it's a special case, and it's not. Claudia, you are absolutely right. Thank you.
You know, we have, we're running a little over, but we do have, we have time for one more comment or question from somebody we haven't heard from yet. So Melanie, do you want to speak up?
I just thought I'd say, as an educator, and maybe half of the people in the room know this, I teach at Whitney Young, so I'm not going to get into all of that, but I want to support what Derrick's saying about the history of education and how it's meant for, I believe, really like ordering and controlling the masses in a way, like, and that history is still so subtly ingrained in the things that happen in a school. And then unless you grew up in a Chicago or an urban public school, you wouldn't necessarily even realize it. You know, I went to a school in a college town in Indiana that I thought was diverse, but that's a whole other story. And then I worked in kind of corporate America for about 6 years before I was a teacher at first Lane Tech, and then now I've been at Whitney Young. And I remember it took me a year or so to be like, wow, we just move these kids around from bell to bell, and we just like, we're looking for order all the time. You know what I mean? Like really subtle things that I believe actually even lead into this school to prison pipeline. So I just want to support everything that Derrick said, that even if you, that we kind of believe it, that there's all these subtle things. And I mean like dress codes and tardies. And by the way, I'm the queen of enforcing a lot of rules because I like rules, but over time it's really made me like examine what is it. And I think order matters for a lot of reasons, especially in large institutions. But I want to reinforce that I believe what you're saying, Derrick, is just so ingrained in our culture, in white American culture, that like we don't even know that it's there. So I just want to support that.
I appreciate that, Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I expected when I first talked with Derrick a week ago and saw the course description for this, we could talk about these issues for hours, but we do need to move along. But next week, we'll be privileged to have the Chief Equity Officer of Chicago Public Schools, Maurice Sweeney, with us. So hopefully what we've learned and talked about today, we'll be able to explore those further with him. And then the next week with Cassie Burke, who's a journalist who covers these issues for the Chicago Public Schools. So,
I am very hopeful that this conversation will inform the next two conversations, Ira. That is my hope.
I am sure it will. So Derrick, thank you so much for taking your time to share with us and to just start the conversation, or for many of us, get us thinking about these issues. And may this continue to inspire us to think and act in small ways and large. And thank you all for joining us today. Just by being here and listening and bearing witness, I think it's a start. And let's just continue with that. So thank you again, and we hope to see you next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derrick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tyra.
Thank you, Ira.
Thank you.